However, it started off in the 1880s being very racist towards Chinese immigrants. And in 1882, it kicked Chinese immigrants out of America. Many of them come down to Mexico. Many of them build the railways in Mexico in these kind of desert regions of kind of Baja California, Sonora, Chihuahua, and they end up there. And they take their tradition of opium smoking, which I think we think is, I mean, opium smoking has a very bad reputation, like basically doing any opiates. But for many Chinese people, it was like you or I having a whiskey at the end of the day or a glass
Yeah.
of red wine. I mean, it was
Right.
basically a relaxant after a hard day's work. Many of them were not, very few of them were actually addicted. We now think maybe only about 3 or 4% were actually addicted.
Wow. Yeah. I think that's one of those cultural things that we see it differently. But
Mm.
yeah, those have definitely been used for many years. And I've learned a little bit of the history of it. So it's pretty fascinating to hear that in Mexico it was prevalent as well.
Did,
Um,
did you ever did you ever
Please.
go to La Chinesca in Mexicali?
No, I haven't.
That's amazing, man. So Mexicali, if you've ever been there, it's so incredibly hot. So the Chinese built an underground city. So it's this network of opium dens, boarding houses, people's houses. It's this extraordinary network
Yeah.
that still exists away from the heat and also, frankly, away from the border patrol and away from customs.
Yeah, that's the same. If you go to there's a town called Pendleton, Oregon, that actually still has the same exact thing, an underground city that the Chinese built for opium dens, but as well as living conditions and as well as to evade any kind of like detection. And so it's a whole city, exactly the same thing you described, the same in Pendleton, Oregon. You have to check that out sometime.
I'm going to take a note of that. Right. Thank you. Get a tour.
You noted that the early drug production is primarily from a local, medicinal use and whatnot. What factors drove the global to global proportions where the cartels adapted to these changes? Like, what made it go from that to boom, kind of what we see today?
Okay. There's kind of two big booms. The first boom, which is I kind of make the equivalent, it's like an oil boom or something, is marijuana in the 1960s. Basically, up to the 1960s, no one in America smokes weed. Very, very few Mexicans do. A handful of uh, bohemian poets, but really very, very minimal. The 60s, as you know, counterculture, rock and roll, everyone starts smoking weed, and tens of thousands, probably even hundreds of thousands of Americans come down to Mexico and find out that there are a few places that where they're growing weed already, and really encourage Mexican peasants to grow the stuff. So previously, I estimate somewhere between 40 and 50 small villages grew marijuana in 1960. By 1975, we're talking thousands of villages. So basically, there's a huge explosion. The second big explosion, and that I think creates the first kind of wave of, let's say, cartels or organized crime groups.
Right.
The second big explosion is Coke. It's massive, and it massively increases the amount of money that cartels are earning. It probably puts a zero on their earnings. They go from earning about 3 billion to about 30 billion by the end of the 90s. So I mean, and it's the American coke addiction. America is in 1999 is taking 70% of the world's coke, and 95% of that coke is going through Mexico.
Yeah, it just goes through Mexico. Mexico is not producing it, right? This is still produced in like Colombia and stuff like that, correct?
It's produced in Colombia, but the Colombians come up with this really kind of smart deal. Basically, up to that point, up to about early 90s, the Mexicans are just basically charging $1,000 per kilo of cocaine. However, the Colombians, after the Americans start putting them in jail, don't want to take the risk anymore. So they say to the Mexicans, okay, you take over a kilo of cocaine, we'll pay you not $1,000, but another kilo of cocaine. Now, a kilo of cocaine is worth $25,000. So suddenly the Mexicans are earning 25 times as much money per kilo of cocaine. And that's the change.
And it meets the demand of what America is consuming.
Yep. I mean, that is the real law of Mexican Mexican drug production. Mexican produces what America wants, needs, demands.
That's what it's been, and that's how it still is.
Yep, absolutely. I mean, there's very, very little market. Mexico has started to get a market in drugs over the last maybe 20 years, but still things like fentanyl, which are obviously a horrible drug that is causing lots of problems in the United States, there's still a tiny market for that in Mexico.
Can you elaborate on the Silk Road and explain how the infrastructures play a role in the past and now current drug trade?
When you say the Silk Road, are you talking about the old Silk Road or the new or the Silk Road as in the internet? The internet-based kind of trafficker
So
of narcotics.
this happens is something you mentioned in the past. It says you mentioned that trade routes like the Silk Road help transform small scale drug production into global industry.
Yeah, well, I mean, basically, that's the Chinese link. That up to that point, the Chinese, there is no Mexican opium production until the Chinese turn up in the 1910s, in the 1920s, and start producing the stuff. And they teach. I mean, I have these extraordinary documents I found where it was quite clear there was like one Chinese farmer in a village, and he was teaching all the Mexicans, like, this is how you do it, this is how you grow it, this is how you harvest it, this is how you mix it up. They started experimenting with putting like tequila and mezcal into the smoking opium to kind of flavor it for a Mexican audience. I mean, it's a classic kind of fusing of the two cultures, like Chinese on the one hand, Mexican on the other.
Has the Silk Road now become the internet?
Yeah, kind of. I mean, where do where do the
Information, right?
precursors come from, right? I mean, the most of the precursors come from China
Yes.
or from India, and they got through the internet, but they're also got through Mexican businessmen who are going over to China and buying this stuff, and also Chinese businessmen who are going over to Mexico. I noticed, and I don't know how much you follow this, but there's a particular variant of narco corridos called tracteño. You heard of this stuff?
Yes. Yes.
So like El del Mercedes. So if you see their videos, they often have like a random Chinese bloke in the back of the videos, and you're like, why is there? And it's a nod to the fact that that's where their links are now. It's all
Oh
about
man.
China.
There's so much to those corridos. There's so much in the culture of the narco culture that like they tell you everything in their own world. There's almost the notoriety behind telling their story.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. Yeah, the whole Chinese connection right now is a big one that I'm curious because I've even heard there's a lot of Chinese businessmen purchasing a lot of land out in Mexico as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's two things, isn't it, happening? The first is the completely licit Chinese industry, which is
Yeah.
moving in throughout Latin America and is taking really the role that the United States used to play. So, I mean, San Luis Potosi, which is a beautiful city that I really love visiting, but it's like right on the other other side of the valleys, there's just like a massive Chinese car factory and almost a kind of parallel Chinese city that's being built, right? On the other hand, you're absolutely right. There's illicit Chinese trade, and we've known since the early 2000s the Chinese have been highly involved in selling precursors and even selling made fentanyl to the Mexicans.